The terrazzo lobby of heliotrope placements could have doubled as a modern art museum, veined stone gleaming like ice under gallery lights, sculptures that were either expensive or ironic, possibly both, and a receptionist who spoke fluent Hush. On that Thursday morning, however, the lobby's aesthetic was ruined by panic specifically. 15 separate sets of designer scuff marks etched into the marble like fossilized adrenaline. The elevator gave its discreet exhale and released another casualty, a Stanford-trained landscape architect named Devin, who had the tragic aura of a man who had been complimented for his potential since age 9 and now understood that word was a curse. He clutched an obsidian portfolio to his chest like a riot shield and addressed the receptionist with the polite hysteria of a person trying not to cry in front of strangers. He asked me, Devin panted, if I knew the difference between a rose and my own incompetence. The receptionist blinked. And then, he continued, I said the soil's vibes are off, and he called security. Security, he repeated, as if the existence of a security department were the real crime. For vibes. From the corner office, Evelyn Park watched Devin flee. She was in her 60s and beautiful in the way of honest portraits. Silver hair that refused to apologize for its audacity, a tailored suit the color of a threatening sky, and the sort of quiet that usually precedes earthquakes. For 3 decades, she'd placed nannies who managed royal tantrums, chefs who fed billionaires spinach without their knowledge, and butlers who could detect gossip at 50 paces and smother it with a napkin. But today, her desk hosted a single dossier that felt cursed. Vale Estate had gardener compensation, $200,000. Base plus hazard differential client, Rowan Vale notes. See terror methodical. Rowan Vale, prodigy headline magnet, founder and CEO of Vale Dynamics, the predictive analytics firm that treated chaos like a Sudoku puzzle and solved it with eerie cheer. He owned 3 patents, 5 houses, and one unbroken reputation as the glacier stunning at a distance, lethal up close, impossible to move. Employees respected him, investors worshipped him, and rumor said any living thing under his supervision behaved like a soldier under inspection, perfect, afraid. Evelyn had almost made peace with early retirement when the elevator chimed again. Out stepped a woman who didn't match the building, hair like cinnamon bark in early evenings, curls caged by a 15-cent scrunchie staging a polite mutiny, a thrift store blazer 2 sizes too ambitious, jeans mended with bright thread like visible history, boots that had trekked across several bad decisions and come out wiser for it. She moved with the wary cheer of a person who had learned to dodge falling pianos and still found something to laugh about. Lena Rivera. I'm here about the gardening position, she said. Her voice held a melody you didn't hear much in San Francisco unless you'd been invited to the right kitchens, Puerto Rican vowels like small warm lights. Evelyn set her espresso down with the care of someone diffusing an explosive. You mean the Vale Estate? That's the one, Lena said, grin bright enough to vandalize the lobby's restraint. Perhaps, Evelyn tried delicately, the Conservatory of Flowers needs staff. Or Golden Gate Park lovely bureaucracy, minimal emotional harm. Whereas the Vale Estate, Mrs. Park, Lena bubbled, dropping into the leather chair like it was a friend. I've been unemployed for 4 months. My checking account has 4 digits total and 2 of them are decimals. She held up a hand. I'm living on instant noodles and borrowed optimism. I am not currently built to be afraid of some overgrown rich boy with a planned obsession. In 30 years, Evelyn had heard Rowan Vale called a lot of things. Overgrown rich boy was the debut. You've researched him, Evelyn said, because ethics is mostly about giving people a chance to reconsider. Deep dive, Lena chirped. Rowan Vale, handsome cryptid, predicted a bond market hiccup to the hour, probably has a cryo chamber for his suits. Lives alone in a hilltop glass masterpiece that screams do not smudge me. People skills of a particularly mean porcupine. Evelyn fought a smile and lost. And you still want the job? I grew up with 3 older brothers, Lena said. I learned 2 truths. 1, taller is not the same as scarier. 2, bullies are usually tired kids in expensive armor. She pulled a weathered notebook from her tote. The cover bore a faded sticker. Plants equals tiny solar-powered friends. My abuela taught me before I had knees steady enough to run that plants respond to love, not to lectures. If his roses are dying under experts, maybe what they need is not an expert. What they need, Evelyn said dryly, is a miracle. I've got time, Lena said, and duct tape, and chaos tolerance. Half an hour later, contract signed, start date set for Monday at 7 MEP. Lena bounced out of the office with a folder labeled strict warnings that she slid into her bag with the affectionate disdain of a person who collects warning labels as souvenirs. Evelyn created a calendar reminder, 48-hour check. If Lena survives, buy champagne, mind methodology. If Lena does not, send Lilith, avoid eye contact with press. High on Mount Tam, rain-silvered and serene, Vale House watched the city glitter and decided not to care. Monday arrived wearing gray. Clouds shouldered each other over the ridgelines. Crows wrote speculative fiction on the air. Vale House rose from the oaks like a cathedral for capital. Glass planes, black steel, a silhouette that could slice you open. Lena's Honda wheezed into the driveway, Ernest among the wolves. She parked beside a car that looked like a myth and got out with a polite defiance of someone who knew the myth couldn't change a flat. The iron gates let her in like a reluctant uncle. The front path unfurled in expensive stone, flanked by hedges trimmed to within an inch of tyranny. Even in decline, the gardens were heartbreak, geometric beds like chessboards, trellises like rib cages, a fountain performing loneliness with such commitment it deserved a grant. You must be the latest sacrifice, said a voice from behind her, dry as a martini poured by an enemy. Lena turned. Mrs. Agatha Quinn had the sort of face that made children tell the truth. Silver hair and a perfect bun, uniform that suggested time was something she respected and would outlast. She stood with the clean authority of an orchestra conductor who'd survived intransigent oboes. Lena Rivera, Lena said, offering her hand with a grin that could sand corners off furniture. New gardener? And you must be the person with the actual power. The left corner of Mrs. Quinn's mouth flirted with rebellion. Housekeeper, she confirmed, shaking Lena's hand in exactly 2 efficient pumps. If you are here to gather gossip, you will be famished. If you are here to garden, a flicker of something suspiciously like hope, you will be the first. They walked. The garden was a painting hung too straight, not a leaf out of place. All the life squeezed out of it like a sheet tucked so tight you could bounce coins. Every bench faced a view. Every path delivered you somewhere you were meant to admire. It was beautiful the way a law is beautiful, elegant, unforgiving. He designs it all himself, Mrs. Quinn said. Paths, benches, shade patterns. Previous gardeners maintained discreetly. Suggestions were treated as insubordination. What about the roses? Lena asked, because sometimes you want to hear the ghost story in the house tell itself. Mrs. Quinn's face softened, his obsession. He's been chasing a hybrid for 3 years. She lowered her voice, conspirator and confessor. Something he could perfect that would not leave. They reached the parterre. Even it was breathtaking. Concentric beds like ripples from a stone. Thorny stems plotting uprisings. Petals that looked like they had tried their best and were ready to be punished for it. Before Lena could ask the questions that were already forming, where is the compost? Who decided the irrigation schedule? Has anyone listened to them? She heard the particular percussion of expensive shoes on gravel. Then the weather arrived. Rowan Vale came down the path like a storm given a suit. He had loosened his tie and rolled his sleeves as if the suit, and he had negotiated detente. His eyes were the kind of green that made botanists poetic and criminals honest. "You're late," he said, and Lena finally heard the quality everyone talked about, the razor wrapped in velvet. "It's 6:58, Lena said, checking her phone. "You said 7? "I said 7 sharp." "Sharp implies precisely at 7, Lena said, pulling out her notebook. She wrote, "Boss has complicated relationship with time and adjectives. Not wandering around admiring the architecture is an interpretation." Mrs. Quinn made the tiny, private sound of a woman who had waited 30 years to witness exactly this. Rowan blinked like a cat, deciding whether to murder the ribbon. "Did you just take notes on me?" "Of course," Lena said. "Field research. If I'm going to work for someone who has escorted 12 gardeners out for insubordination, I'd like to identify the early warning signs before I start alphabetizing my apologies." "Most people find me intimidating," Rowan said. "I had 3 older brothers," Lena said. "You're tall, rich, and moody." They were tall, broke, and moody. Similar silhouette. Better tailoring. Rowan looked at Mrs. Quinn like the universe had glitched, then back at Lena like it had done so on purpose. He gestured at the roses with a commander's chin. "Show me." He followed. He told himself he was merely supervising an expensive experiment and not, for instance, curious. The morning tasted like metal and eucalyptus. Fog moved in slow white animals. When Lena knelt in the damp soil, the garden banked its breath. "Hi," she said to a rosebush, voice tender, hand steady. "I'm Lena. You've been doing your best with bad instructions." Rowan almost laughed. Then she began with a competence that offended his bias toward credentials. She tested the soil, scanning pH like a witch reading tea leaves, pinched away dead blooms with ruthless affection, examined cane angles and airflow, frowned at mulch like a detective frowning at a forged alibi. Mrs. Quinn arrived with coffee and watched Lena with the expression of a woman pretending a cathedral, Iason making her a little religious. "Helicopter parenting," Lena announced 30 minutes later, cupping a handful of heavy, cold soil. "Overwatered, over-fertilized, overscheduled. The roots are pale and knotted like they're having an anxiety attack. They're trying to be what you want instead of what they are." "You can determine that," Rowan said, from dirt. "Dirt is autobiography," Lena said. "Yours is telling me you're trying to buy results with effort. Perfection is suffocating them. We need better drainage, kinder light, and less supervision." Rowan's jaw did something unfamiliar. "Less supervision?" "Plants don't thrive under a microscope," she said, gently teasing apart a mat of roots and setting them in looser soil like a parent loosening a backpack strap. "They thrive when you pay attention with curiosity instead of control." If this were one of those plushy TED Talks where the speaker wore a headset and hugged the stage, perhaps this would be where the audience laughed and then secretly cried. Rowan did neither. He stood very still and felt something inside him creak like ice. 2 weeks, he said, partly to her, partly to the part of himself that hated uncertainty. "If you can reverse the trend in 2 weeks, you can do as you like. 2 weeks is stingy," she said, smiling. "But I appreciate the fear." He should have bristled. Instead, he felt the prickle of a laugh that had forgotten it lived inside him. "You're impertinent. You're welcome." "Start," he said, and left before she could see that he had stayed 2 beats too long. From a second-floor office, he watched her work, a small figure in denim and determination, rearranging his certainties with a trowel. She sang sometimes Spanish folk melodies that sounded like sunlight filtered through leaves, and then she talked to the roses in the same voice. Rowan used with servers who had brought him the wrong whiskey, kind, precise, unwilling to accept the wrong outcome. At 10, Theo March appeared with his tablet and a face that begged for the safety of normal. "Lockwood Capital is here," he said, "merger worth several small moons. I've made the caterers sign NDAs regarding your preference for lemon tarts over profit." "Cancel it," Rowan said, without turning from the glass. Theo blinked. "Sir?" "Move it," Rowan amended, carefully. "Tomorrow mid-morning." Theo's thumbs raced. They've asked if you were abducted by aliens. Should I use the code phrase? No, Rowan said, watching Lena laugh at something Mrs. Quinn said and feeling a flicker like the first spark in a dark room. Tell them I'm occupied. With what? Photosynthesis, he said, deadpan. Theo went still, then grinned for the first time in weeks. Copy that. The next 10 days dismantled the garden's decorum with the gentleness of good chaos. Rigid geometry softened. Path edges blurred. In bold acts of horticultural treason, California poppies popped up between aristocratic hybrid teas like confetti at a black tie gala. A trellis once starched with order loosed itself into a flirtation with morning glories. The fountain stopped looking lonely and began to look patient. Lena didn't perform miracles. She did something slower and more scandalous. She made room. She thinned, she breathed, she let light in. She installed redirectors on the irrigation to mimic a less anxious rain. She set up a soil schedule that looked like kindness. She asked the roses who they wanted to be, and she waited while they remembered. Rowan joined her at dusk. At first, he hovered like a CEO at an intern's desk. He asked questions in a tone that tried not to be an interrogation and didn't quite succeed. He touched nothing except the fence at his own restraint. Here, she said on the fourth evening, handing him a trowel. Try doing instead of judging. He knelt like a supplicant with expensive knees. The ground was cool, the smell of it intimate. She positioned his hands the way she might correct a dance posture firm. Sure, not flirtatious, though his pulse misread on purpose. Guide, don't force, she murmured, fingers showing him the arc. Listen for how it wants to grow. He crouched, the world narrowing to loam in her voice. It was shockingly difficult to stop acting like the dirt had a quarterly report due. But then, slowly, he felt the stubborn ease of a root finding home. He gentled, he breathed. Good, she said softly, praise given sparingly. He felt it like summer on skin. Theo started showing up after office hours in a hoodie that said Plant Dad, like an unconvincing alibi. He claimed it was to monitor the reallocation of guard patrols. Mostly he pretended to study his phone and watched his boss laugh. Mrs. Quinn relaxed in increments. She stopped carrying the expression of a woman bracing for the distant crash of the fine china and developed the expression of a woman who knows where the tape is. She began to bring lemon bars to the garden at twilight and tell stories of the house from before it learned to hold its breath. Lena, for her part, slept like someone who had earned it, woke before dawn, and called her Abuela Inez every night to report in detail on the progress of strangers and roses. Abuela, laughing in a kitchen 3 cities away, dispensed recipes and spells, put a raw egg in the planting hole for tomatoes. Yes, Mia, literal magic. On day 11, the garden lifted its chin. The roses hadn't transformed into saints. They had remembered that being a rose was enough. Lena took a clipping pail, tangly, anxious, and carried it to Rowan's office like evidence in a trial. She plunked it down on the polished desk. Soil set upon oiled walnut, a scandal. They're performing, she said, climbing onto the corner of his desk like a cat who had learned to knock over only the necessary things. They retrying so hard to meet your standard, they've forgotten they have their own. People who meet my standard, Rowan said, usually thank me later. Plants, Lena said, don't write thank you notes. What do you suggest? He asked, and the question landed differently than it would have 2 weeks ago. He meant it, and he meant something else with it. What do you suggest for me? She smiled like a sunrise that took its time arriving. An experiment. We make imperfection the point. We encourage wild. For 2 weeks, we stopped telling them who to be. That sounds like anarchy. That sounds like trust. He stared at the little plant. He thought of Serena Lockwood and her elegant contempt for mess. He thought of his mother, Eleanor, and the way she folded grief into lists. He thought of himself, age 13, and the science fair project that lost because it was a year too early for the world to be ready for it. He thought about control and what it had cost him that nobody could measure, not even his software. Fine, he said, on one condition, which is, you teach me, he said. The two words cost more than he liked to admit. Hands-on, deal. She offered her hand. When he took it, something sparked, not a tinderbox ignition, not a melodramatic crackle, more like the quiet click of a lock when a key finally finds the tumblers it was cut to turn. They held each other's gaze a microsecond too long. Theo knocked, a frantic metronome. Sir, Lockwood Capital is here early. Tell them to wait, Rowan said without looking away. We already told them to wait once. Tell them to practice acceptance, Rowan said. Theo exhaled, like a man who had discovered his boss's true religion and found it unexpectedly wholesome. Copy that. Practicing acceptance. The day the roses opened 2 shades deeper than last week, Serena Lockwood arrived. She came down the path in a cream suit that was illegal under several municipal codes if worn near mud. Her hair did not notice the breeze. Her heels struck the gravel like punctuation for a sentence that ended with "you cannot possibly be serious." "Hello, Rowan," she said, voice politely bored. Then she saw Lena. Her smile sharpened. "And you must be—" "Lena Rivera," Lena said, extending her dirt-smeared hand, and the full weight of her refusal to be diminished. Serena took in the hand, the smudges, the patched knees, the bandana you could love or hate, but not ignore. Rowan always did enjoy projects. "Plants aren't projects," Lena said sweetly. "And neither are people." "We have a merger," Serena said, but her eyes stayed on Lena, cataloging, pricing, concluding. Or had. "We'll need to discuss whether your new hobbies compromise fiduciary obligations." Rowan felt the pivot in his body, the old logic of obligation like a trap closing, the new logic of joy like a door opening. He had never been ambivalent about Serena. He had been grateful. She was a mirror polished to blinding, reflecting him as an instrument that produced outcomes. With her, he had been optimized. He had never been held. Lena didn't flinch. She didn't posture. She did the thing she always did, named what was true. "I see him," she said to Serena, "not his number, not his press. Him. That's my credential. You think that qualifies you?" Serena laughed lightly, forgetting she was in a garden that judged all performances. "Yes," Lena said, with an ease that stunned Rowan, "because when he's with me, he isn't perfect. He's happy." There was a hush. Even the fountain paused. Serena looked at Rowan. "You're having a phase." "I am," he said, a rebellion against pressure. Serena smiled in relief. "It's not a phase," he said gently. "It's a choice." Serena's poise hiccuped. "You'll regret it," she said, which was the most honest thing she'd said all afternoon. He reached for Lena's hand. Dirt met cufflink. "If I do," he said, "it'll be my regret." Serena turned on her perfect heel and left the way she'd come. Her perfume at war with eucalyptus. Mrs. Quinn emerged from behind a hedge, holding 2 glasses of water as if she had merely been thinking about hydration and not eavesdropping with the avidity of a woman who had earned it. "You handled that well," she said, offering water to Lena and respectful silence to Rowan. "I didn't set anything on fire," Lena said. "Not physically," Mrs. Quinn said, and allowed herself a smile that traveled all the way to the ghost places. That night, after Lena went home smelling like crushed basil and victory, Rowan didn't work. He walked. The property sloped from the house's glass sternum into a garment of oaks and ferns. In a stand of trees at the perimeter, he found something he'd never bothered to explore. A small derelict greenhouse, its panes fogged with time, its door lever stiff. Inside, moonlight turned the dust into confetti. A wooden table waited, stained with chlorophyll and old tea. There was a terracotta pot with a hairline crack and a note under it in his mother's script. You cannot schedule the moment something loves you back. He stood among the ghosts of someone else's patience and understood, with a flare of embarrassed clarity, that he'd built a life so efficient and never had to wait for love. The next morning, he arrived in the garden at 6 with soil under his fingernails. Before coffee and a grin he didn't realize he wore. "You're early," Lena said, measuring him with a glance that registered the greenhouse dust on his cuffs. "Sharp," he said. 7 sharp. "Look at you," she teased, learning adjectives. "I'm learning you," he almost said. What he said was, "Where do we start?" "Guide, don't force," she murmured, handing him the trowel. "Oh, is that?" He nodded, as if she had just told him how not to miss his life. The Great Garden Revolution began the way revolutions often do, too quietly to be taken seriously. A wildflower here, a loosened trellis there, Lena humming snatches of old boleros under her breath, while Rowan watched from the office window with a mug he no longer remembered to drink from. By week's end, the changes were impossible to ignore. The geometric rigidity of the rose beds softened to organic waves that made the air look like music. Sunflowers sprouted along the edges with cheerful impudence, towering like gatecrashers at a formal gala. Daisies danced at the hems of aristocratic hybrid teas, like children running barefoot in a ballroom. Rowan, who had once measured his days in meetings and market forecasts, now measured them in minutes stolen at the kitchen, window mug in hand, watching Lena coax life back into the soil as if she were teaching it to breathe again. "Sir?" Theo asked one morning, tablet clutched like a life raft. "You've been standing here for 23 minutes. Are we rescheduling the morning call, or are we pivoting the company toward interpretive staring?" "Cancel it," Rowan murmured. Theo typed mechanically, his face flat but his eyes carrying all the drama of an unpaid Greek chorus. "Sir, that's the 4th call you've canceled this week. The board is beginning to use the word concerning. Jennifer from accounting started a betting pool. Highest odds currently, alien abduction. 2nd place, gardening cult." "Gardening cult," Rowan said absently, "has better merch." That afternoon, Lena stormed into his office carrying a shrub that looked like a witness for the prosecution. Soil flecked her cheek, her curls were a rebellion under a bandana, and her eyes were bright with righteous indignation. "We need to talk," she declared, setting the plan on his desk like Exhibit A. Recognizing an incoming storm front, retreated with the speed of a man preserving his hairline. "I'll just update my resume in pencil." "They're performing," Lena said, hands on her hips. "Not growing, performing. They're exhausting themselves trying to meet your expectations instead of being what they are." "They're roses," Rowan said, though the words sounded hollow even to him. "They're people," she shot back, "or close enough. They're so busy trying to be perfect that they're miserable." He stared at her, the accusation landing in places he boarded up years ago. "So busy trying to be perfect that you're miserable." She hadn't said it to him, but he felt it like a mirror. "What's the solution?" She stepped closer, eyes alive with mischief and something softer. "We let them be messy. We let them fail. We let them be wild." That sounds like chaos. That sounds like life. She leaned across his desk until he could smell earth and rain on her skin. "And I want you to help me." He was a man who made billion-dollar calls without blinking. Yet her request made his pulse stumble. He could have said no. He could have dismissed it as sentiment, but instead he heard himself say, "All right, teach me." She grinned, dirt-stained hand extended across the mahogany. When their palms met, the spark was so immediate, so undeniable, that for once in his life, Rowan Vale did not second-guess the data. "Partners," she said. "Partners," he agreed, though he knew he was already in deeper than partnership. By the 2nd week, The garden was unrecognizable alive in a way that unsettled the house. Mrs. Quinn stopped carrying her clipboard like a shield and began appearing with iced lemonade for the workers. Theo started arriving in the evenings wearing a hoodie that read Plant Dad and pretending he was there to monitor deliveries, not to listen to Lena sing folk songs to the roses. Even Rowan's parents noticed. Charles and Eleanor Vale made their monthly inspection visit, sweeping into the kitchen like royalty reviewing an eccentric province. They found their son in jeans and soil-stained boots, laughing at something Lena had said while flipping pancakes that could have qualified as modern art. Charles looked at Eleanor, bewildered. "He looks happy." "He looks concerningly unpolished," Eleanor corrected, though her voice carried a note of wonder. But happiness had enemies. One stormy night, the estate's security system blared. Drones caught the shadow of a hooded intruder fleeing across the gardens. Beds were trampled. Several of Rowan's prize hybrid clippings were gone. And in the mulch, scrawled with a boot heel, was a message: "Return to order." The next morning, Rowan prowled the paths like a general surveying a battlefield. His jaw was granite, his voice sharp. This was targeted. Lena crouched by the scarred beds, fingers brushing soil with a gentleness that contrasted his fury. "Anger won't fix it," she said, listening low. He looked at her, incredulous. Listening to what? Dirt? "To whoever's desperate enough to sabotage a garden," she said softly. "This isn't random. This is personal." Later that week, they caught the vandal in 4K, not Serena Lockwood. Not a rival firm, but a former Vale gardener Rowan had fired for suggesting changes. The man had been living in bitterness, furious at being replaced by wildflowers. Rowan wanted to prosecute. Old habits of control rose like armor, but Lena's hand touched his wrist warm, grounding. "What if instead of punishment," she said, "we offer him another chance, somewhere his voice matters?" It was absurd, naive, unbusinesslike, and Rowan found himself agreeing. The man was released with a settlement and a job at a community restoration project. For the first time in years, Rowan discovered mercy was more satisfying than victory. Lena, furious at the sabotage, turned it into fuel. She began recording short videos in the garden tips about soil, pep talks for struggling plants, the occasional rant about helicopter parenting roses. Theo, who moonlighted as a video editor, posted them on TikTok under Grow with Lena. The account exploded. Clips of Rowan fumbling with a wheelbarrow went viral. Comments poured in. The billionaire soft-launched his feelings, then hard-launched his humanity. When he said guide, don't force. "Yeah, I'm crying in Home Depot." Enemies to lovers but make it horticulture. At first, Rowan protested. "I am not entertainment." But the numbers didn't lie. Investor meetings, previously combative, softened. Clients remarked on his approachable leadership. Vale Dynamics stock ticked up. His board, once suspicious of his sudden disappearances into the garden, now encouraged them. "Apparently being human is bullish," Theo quipped, scrolling through analytics. Who knew? For Rowan, it wasn't about the views. It was about the quiet moments Lena refused to record, the way she laughed when dirt streaked across his jaw, the way she taught him to breathe through frustration instead of commanding it, the way she treated every living thing as if it were worth the risk of love. At night, he found himself in the old greenhouse, sweeping away decades of dust. He imagined string lights draped across the beams, flowers blooming where cracks had let in rain, and Lena standing there, smiling at the chaos they had made beautiful. For the first time in his adult life, Rowan Vale stopped fearing imperfection. And that was when he realized he was no longer just saving a garden. He was falling in love. Autumn came dressed in gold and fire. The roses, once starched into submission, now sprawled in joyful rebellion. The wildflower meadow glittered like spilled jewels. And on the horizon, a wedding. Rowan, who had once orchestrated board meetings with military precision, now found himself arguing over the merits of mason jars versus crystal flutes. Lena wanted mason jars. Rowan initially wanted crystal, then saw her grin when she stacked jam jars into a pyramid and declared it architecture for the people. Mason jars won unanimously, but California weather, with its fondness for drama, had other plans. On rehearsal day, an atmospheric river rolled in, drowning the meadow under relentless rain. The hay bales bobbed like small, soggy ships. Guests texted with polite alarm. Vendors panicked. The planner hyperventilated into a silk scarf. Old Rowan would have treated the storm as an enemy. New Rowan walked barefoot into the downpour and laughed, head tilted back, rain streaming down his jaw. "Okay," Lena shouted, hair plastered to her face, eyes blazing with defiance. We pivot. Ceremony in the greenhouse. Reception under string lights. Guests get clear umbrellas. We call it wet look chic. Theo, soaked and exhilarated, yelled, "It's giving The Notebook, but without the trauma." Even Charles and Eleanor Vale, who had arrived armed with skepticism and umbrellas the size of small aircraft, were caught by the absurd joy of it. Charles muttered, "Our son's gone mad," but Eleanor, watching Rowan pull Lena into a rain-soaked kiss, whispered, "Or maybe he's finally sane." That night, with the storm pounding the glass roof of the greenhouse like impatient applause, Rowan couldn't sleep. He wandered down, barefoot, to find Lena barefoot too, checking the roses. "Cold feet?" she teased. "Warm feet." "Muddy heart," he replied, pulling her close. "I used to think control kept me safe. Turns out joy does." And the rain blessed their decision with thunder. The day of the wedding dawned misty but clear. The meadow was still a swamp, but the greenhouse gleamed like a crystal heart waiting to be filled. Guests entered through rows of tomatoes and basil, finding seats on reclaimed wine barrels draped in vintage quilts. Edison bulbs glowed overhead, casting constellations across glass panes beaded with rain. Rowan stood among roses and thyme, wearing a suit that fit him not as armor, but a celebration. Theo, grinning in the role of best man, carried the rings on a moss pillow and whispered irreverent commentary that made half the guests choke on laughter. Mrs. Quinn, proud and teary, adjusted Lena's veil with the tenderness of a surrogate mother. And then Lena walked in, not polished, not perfected. Curls wild, eyes bright, dressed simple but radiant because it was hers. She carried herself with the reckless joy of someone who had already chosen her life and was just making it official. Rowan's breath caught. For once in his meticulously planned life, he had no script and he didn't want one. Their vows were handwritten, imperfect, unforgettable. "I spent years building fortresses," Rowan said, voice rough, steady. "You walked in with seeds. You taught me that flourishing isn't the same as performing. I promised to choose growth over perfection, to guide, not force. To laugh when pancakes burn, and to stay when storms come." "I spent years surviving," Lena said, her smile trembling like sunlight on water. "You gave me a garden. You showed me wild can be holy. I promised to be your partner in mess and miracle, to laugh at your attempts at strategic planting, to love you when you're human, not perfect." When they kissed, it wasn't polite. It wasn't staged. It was real rain, roses, and something uncontainable blooming between them. Theo posted a short clip to TikTok with the caption, "Even billionaires need dirt under their nails to find love." It went viral before dessert. 3 months later, the Vale estate had transformed into something Rowan, S. old self, would have considered a nightmare, and his new self considered paradise. The wildflower meadow had returned, now threaded with paths of crushed granite for visitors. The roses bloomed in riotous disobedience, imperfect but abundant. A small orchard had taken root on the southern slope. Oranges, lemons, apples, figs. Rowan and Lena planted the first tree together, hands dirty, hearts light. On Sundays, children from the neighborhood came for gardening classes Lena taught, their laughter filling spaces that had once echoed with silence. Rowan joined in, demonstrating how not to panic when a seedling flopped. "Guy, don't force," he told them, earning giggles and mud-streaked hugs. Vale dynamics, far from collapsing under his looser grip, flourished. Delegation bred creativity. His board, once terrified, now praised his human-centered leadership. Investors called him visionary. Employees called him bearable. At Grow Old with Lena hit 10 million followers. Clips of Rowan trying to parallel park a tractor or explaining compost in CEO speak became internet war. Comments flooded. Therapy, but with roses. Enemies to lovers, season finale unlocked. When he said he chose growth over perfection, I bawled in Home Depot. Even Charles and Eleanor softened. They visited often, Eleanor even joining Lena in the kitchen one Saturday to learn the art of pancakes that looked like crime scenes but tasted like heaven. Charles walked the orchard with Rowan, quiet, then said, "You look lighter." Rowan smiled and replied, "I am." One evening, as the sun bled pink and gold across the valley, Rowan and Lena sat beneath the first orange tree they'd planted. She leaned against him, soil still under her nails, a mug of tea warming her hands. "Any regrets?" she asked softly. "Only one," he said. She tilted her head, amused. "Oh? That I didn't post the job sooner." She laughed, kissed him, and the orchard rustled with the sound of a future unfolding wild, imperfect, alive. Some fairy tales end with happily ever after. Rowan and Lena's didn't end at all. It grew. One season, one garden, one perfectly imperfect day at a time.